American Revolution timeline. In 1765, King George in British Parliament put the Stamp Act on the colonists. The Stamp Act is the taxing of printed paper goods. King George in British Parliament thought that this tax was fair because they needed to pay off all the debt from their war with France, and also for the stationed soldiers protecting colonists in America. The colonists thought this was unfair because they were paying the debt for wars that they were not a part of. In October of 1765, two men, Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, protested the Stamp Act. Patrick Henry organized the Stamp Act Congress, where 9 leaders, one from 9 different colonies, urged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Samuel Adams then later organized the Sons of Liberty. Soon, Sons of Liberty groups started forming in other colonies. The Sons of Liberty started to scare the stamp agents, the collectors of tax, and by the time the Stamp Act was in full swing, the stamp agents did not dare to sell stamps to the colonists. In 1766, King George in Parliament repeated the Stamp Act, but were thinking of another way to tax the colonists. In 1767, Parliament's Treasurer, Charles Townshend, called for a new tax. Parliament passed this tax as called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts placed a tariff or tax on imported goods on paper, wool, tea, and other goods from Britain. King George and other British leaders hoped the colonists would agree to pay the tariffs. They also wanted to show the colonists who was in power. The Townshend Acts caused new protests in the colonies. Colonies from Georgia to New Hampshire colonists decided to boycott British imports. Colonists said they would rather do without British products than pay new taxes. On March 5, 1770, some annoyed colonists started to throw snowballs at Hugh White and his soldiers because Hugh White hit Edward Garrick in the head with the butt of his musket. The soldiers then panicked when more colonists started to gather and shot into the crowd at no one's command. The first one killed was a freed-back sailor named Crispus Attucks. The youngest one killed was a 17-year-old named Samuel Maverick. This incident is known as the Boston Massacre. The same day, Parliament voted to repeal Townshend Acts, but kept the tea tax, which started the Tea Act. In 1772, Samuel Adams was working on a way to share news faster between the colonies. He formed the Committee of Correspondence in 1772 in Boston. Soon, more groups were formed in towns all over the colonies. They wrote to each other about local events and were sent to each other by express writers. One of the writers is famed Paul Revere. He could make the trip from Boston to New York and back in about a week. In 1773, the Committees of Correspondence began writing about the Tea Act, a new law passed by Parliament. The Tea Act said that the East India Trading Company was the only company allowed to sell tea to the colonists. The colonists so far had refused to pay British taxes, and they weren't about to start. The colonists declared that ships bringing British tea to the colonists would not be allowed to unload any colonial port. In late 1773, 3 ships carrying British tea sailed into Boston Harbor. On that night, December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, rowed out to the British ships shouting, "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight!" boarded the ships and dumped the tea into the harbor, then started singing, "Rally Mohawks, bring out your axes, and tell King George we'll pay no taxes." Once word reached to London, King George and Parliament thought that Boston should be punished. So, in 1774, British Parliament made a law to punish Boston. This law included these punishments. Boston colonists had to quarter or house and feed British soldiers that had now been sent back to Boston. Massachusetts was put under control of British General Thomas Gage, and the port of Boston was closed. No ships were allowed to come in or go until all the tea that was destroyed was paid for. When Britain closed Boston's harbor, Boston was badly hurt. Boston made their life on trade, so other colonies had to give Boston food supplies and money. The Intolerable Acts also split the country as to who they were loyal to. Those loyal to King George were known as Loyalists, or Tories. Those loyal to the colonies were called Patriots or Rebels. The Committee of Correspondence began to discuss on how to oppose the Intolerable Acts. In September 1774, representatives from all 13 colonies except Georgia came together in a meeting known as the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. George Washington was the representative for Virginia. In the French and Indian War, Washington had fought with the British, but now he was ready to fight against the British, if necessary. He promised, "I will raise up 1,000 men and march myself at their head for the relief of Boston." They decided that each colony should also start training their militia. On April 18, 1775, that night, Paul Revere, Mr. William Dawes, and Colonel Prescott rode out saying that the British are coming, to warn everybody to get out of town. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft the belfry arch of the north church tower as a signal light, one if by land, two if by sea. And I, on the opposite shore, will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up in arm." In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress met again in Philadelphia and appointed George Washington the General of the Continental Army. On June 17, 1775, a man named Colonel Prescott and his men fought the British, but lost. It was a costly win for the British. They lost more than 1,000 men. Even though the battle was at Breed's Hill, they called it the Battle of Bunker Hill, for it was nearby. In July 1775, Congress sent a letter called the Olive Branch Petition to King George to tell him that the American colonists were still loyal to Great Britain. It also said that war could be avoided if the British Parliament would give colonists more freedom to govern themselves. King George didn't even look at the petition. He said he would use force to put a speedy end to what he thought was an illegal rebellion in America. In January 1776, a recent British immigrant, Thomas Paine, wrote and published Common Sense. He argued that we needed to part from Britain. He also said that a government of our own was a natural right. He convinced many Americans that we needed to declare independence. In July 1776, a committee formed to draft the Declaration of Independence. The committee was made up of Ben Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, and celebrations broke out from Georgia all the way up to New England. That day, patriots tore down a statue of King George and made the metal into bullets for the Continental Army. In August 1776, the Declaration was signed by John Hancock and warned his fellow signers that there must be no pulling different ways. We must all hang together. All the signers knew that it would be very dangerous to sign it because they knew they would be considered traitors and could be hung. They took all their chances to help make their country free.